My name is Julius Malema. For many years, people have known me as a politician. They have seen me standing before large crowds, speaking about justice, leadership, economic freedom, and the future of South Africa. They have watched my speeches on television. They have read articles about me in newspapers. They have heard supporters praise me and critics challenge me. That is the public side of my life. But there is another side that very few people ever see. It is the side that emerges when the cameras are gone, when the microphones are turned off, when there is no audience to impress and no political debate to win. It is the side where questions about faith become more important than questions about power. Today, I want to share one of those moments with you. I want to tell you about a phone call that stayed with me long after it ended. A phone call that forced me to think deeply about leadership, responsibility, and my relationship with Jesus Christ. The man on the other end of that call was Greg Laurie. Many of you know him well. For decades, he has preached the gospel to millions of people. He has spent much of his life encouraging people to follow Christ and to place their trust in God. What surprised me was not that Greg Laurie called. What surprised me was why he called. I assumed the conversation would be about politics. After all, politics is what most people want to discuss when they contact me. Some want to debate policy. Others want to discuss elections. Many want to talk about the future of Africa. But this conversation was different from the very beginning. It was not about governments. It was not about campaigns. It was not about political victories or political failures. Instead, it centered on a question that every Christian must eventually answer. A question that no position, title, or achievement can avoid. A question that reaches beyond politics and speaks directly to the human heart. Do we truly place Jesus above everything else in our lives? Or do we only follow him when it is convenient? That question may sound simple, but the older I become, the more I realize how difficult it really is. Because life constantly offers us alternatives, power, recognition, comfort, influence, success. Every one of these things can slowly compete for the place that belongs to God alone. The danger is not always obvious. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it disguises itself as ambition. Sometimes it looks like opportunity. And sometimes it appears in the very areas where we believe we are doing good. That evening, as I listened to Greg Laurie speak, I realized we were not discussing theology in an abstract way. We were discussing something deeply personal, something that affects leaders, pastors, business owners, fathers, mothers, and every person who claims to follow Christ. The conversation challenged me. It made me examine my own heart. It reminded me that leadership is not only about what people see. It is also about what God sees. And what happened during that call led me to make a statement that surprised even Greg himself. A statement about Jesus. A statement about power. A statement about what truly matters when all the titles and positions of this world eventually fade away. What began as an unexpected phone call from California became one of the most thought-provoking conversations I have had in a very long time. And it all started on a quiet evening that I will never forget. The evening began like many others. I was in Johannesburg, South Africa. It had been a long day filled with meetings, discussions, and responsibilities that come with public life. By the time I arrived home, it was already past 8 o'clock in the evening. The city was beginning to slow down. The noise of the day was fading. I was looking forward to a few quiet moments before preparing for the next day's work. Then my phone rang. At first, I almost ignored it. International calls at that hour are not unusual, but they are rarely urgent. When I looked at the screen, I noticed that the call was coming from California in the United States. For a moment, I wondered who it could be. I answered. A familiar voice greeted me. "Good evening, Julius." It was Greg Laurie. I immediately recognized his voice. Even people who do not follow Christian ministry closely have often heard his name. For decades, Greg Laurie has been one of America's most recognized pastors. Through the Harvest Crusades, he has preached the gospel to millions of people. He has spoken in stadiums, churches, and gatherings across the world. His messages have reached people from every background imaginable, young and old, rich and poor, political leaders, and ordinary workers. I greeted him warmly. We exchanged a few pleasantries. Then I waited for him to explain the purpose of his call. Naturally, I assumed it would involve politics in some way. That is usually what people want to discuss with me. Some wish to talk about South Africa. Others want to discuss elections, economics, or international affairs. I expected something similar, but almost immediately, Greg surprised me. He said, "Julius, I am not calling to talk about politics." I remember smiling because that was the exact opposite of what I expected. Before I could respond, he continued, "I am calling because I want to talk about Jesus." There was a brief silence, not an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that happens when someone says something unexpected. Then he added another sentence that caught my attention even more. "I want to talk about Jesus and the responsibility of leadership." At that moment, I realized this would not be an ordinary conversation. There would be no discussion about political parties, no debate about government policies, no analysis of current events. Instead, we were about to discuss something far deeper. Leadership itself. Not leadership as the world often understands it, but leadership through the lens of faith. Leadership as something that carries accountability before God. I leaned back in my chair and listened carefully. There was sincerity in Greg's voice. He was not calling to challenge me. He was not calling to criticize me. And he was certainly not calling to seek publicity. There were no cameras, no reporters, no audience, just two men speaking honestly across two continents, one sitting in Johannesburg, the other sitting thousands of miles away in California. What struck me most was how quickly the conversation moved beyond titles. In public life, people often focus on positions. They ask whether someone is a president, a pastor, a business executive, or a political leader. But Greg seemed completely uninterested in titles. Instead, he wanted to discuss the person behind the title, the character behind the influence, the heart behind the leadership. As the conversation continued, I began to sense that God might be using this unexpected call to remind me of something important. Something easy to forget in a world that constantly celebrates power and visibility. The world teaches us to measure success by numbers. How many followers? How many supporters? How many victories? How much influence? But faith often measures success differently. Faith asks whether we have remained obedient, whether we have remained humble, whether we have remained faithful. I did not know it yet, but the next question Greg would ask me would force me to think carefully about what leadership truly means. And it would reveal the real reason he had decided to call me that evening. That question changed the direction of our entire conversation. After Greg told me that he wanted to discuss Jesus and leadership, I became curious. I wanted to know what had prompted him to make the call. After all, he had spent decades speaking with pastors, evangelists, ministry leaders, and Christians from around the world. Why was he calling me? Before long, he answered that question himself. Julius, he said, a few days ago, I watched one of your speeches. I immediately tried to remember which speech he might be referring to. Over the years, I had given countless public addresses. Some focused on economic issues. Others dealt with social justice, education, or national development. I could not know which one had captured his attention. Then he explained. He had seen a clip circulating through various media platforms. In that speech, I had made a statement about leadership. The statement itself was simple. I had said that leaders exist to serve their people. Nothing more, nothing less. At the time, it was simply a point I felt strongly about. But Greg told me that those words stayed with him long after he heard them. He said that when he listened to that statement, he immediately thought about the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. Then he quoted a principle that Christians around the world have heard many times. Jesus taught that whoever wants to be great must become a servant. The kingdom of God often operates in the opposite direction from the systems of the world. The world teaches people to climb higher so they can be served. Jesus taught people to humble themselves so they could serve others. Greg paused before continuing. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since that evening. Today, he said, many leaders want followers to serve them. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just an observation, a sad observation. He continued, Jesus taught the exact opposite. Those words hung in the air between us. Because if we are honest, they challenge every leader. Not only politicians, pastors, business executives, community leaders, even parents. Anyone who has influence over another person must eventually answer the same question. Am I serving the people entrusted to me? Or am I expecting them to serve me? The conversation became more personal. Greg was no longer discussing leadership in general terms. He wanted to understand how I viewed it myself. Then he asked the question that revealed the true purpose of his call. Julius, he said, when you think about leadership, do you see it primarily as power? I listened carefully. He was not finished. Or do you see it as a responsibility before God? For a moment, I did not answer. Not because I did not understand the question, but because I understood it very well. Some questions deserve quick answers. Others deserve honest reflection. This was one of those questions. Throughout history, countless leaders have pursued power. Many have gained it. Many have lost it. Some have used it wisely. Others have misused it. But very few people stop to consider that leadership might be something more than authority. That it might actually be stewardship. That one day every leader, regardless of rank or influence, must answer for how that influence was used. As I thought about Greg's question, I remembered something that becomes increasingly clear with age. Power is temporary. No office lasts forever. No title lasts forever. No public approval lasts forever. The crowds eventually leave. The headlines disappear. The applause fades. But character remains. And according to Scripture, accountability remains as well. I finally responded. I told Greg that I believe leadership is a responsibility, a serious responsibility, not simply to the people who support you, but also before God, because every decision affects real lives. Every action influences other people. Every leader leaves a legacy, whether good or bad. Greg agreed. Then he shared something that struck me deeply. He said that many people spend their entire lives pursuing positions they are never spiritually prepared to hold. They work tirelessly to gain influence, yet they rarely ask whether their hearts are ready for the weight that influence carries. The more we spoke, the more I realized that Greg had not called because of politics. He had not called because of ideology. He had called because he recognized a principle that Jesus himself taught. A leader should serve. And he wanted to know whether I truly believed that principle when no audience was present and no applause could be gained from saying it. That realization changed the tone of the conversation. This was no longer a discussion about public leadership. It was becoming a discussion about personal accountability, about what God sees behind the public image, about what remains when the speeches end and the crowds go home. And then Greg asked a question that forced me to examine something even deeper. A question about how Jesus himself measures a leader. For several seconds, I found myself completely silent before answering. And that silence revealed more than I expected. After we spoke about leadership and responsibility, the conversation became quieter. Not because either of us had run out of things to say. In fact, it was the opposite. The subjects we were discussing were becoming more serious. The kind of subjects that cannot be answered with slogans or prepared speeches. For a few moments, Greg listened. Then he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Julius, he said, how do you think Jesus evaluates a leader? The question sounded simple, but the moment I heard it, I realized how difficult it truly was. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I sat quietly. My mind began moving through the ways people normally measure leadership. The world has many standards. Some leaders are judged by popularity. Others are judged by elections. Some are judged by wealth. Others by influence. Many are judged by how often their names appear in the news. For years, I had watched societies celebrate these measurements. Large crowds, public recognition, political victories, famous speeches, powerful positions. The world often treats these things as proof of success. But as I considered Greg's question, something felt incomplete, because none of those measurements seemed sufficient when placed before Jesus. I thought about the stories recorded in Scripture. Again and again, Jesus looked beyond appearances. He looked beyond status. He looked beyond public reputation. He looked directly at the heart. A person could appear successful to everyone around them and still be spiritually empty. A person could appear insignificant to the world and yet be greatly honored in the sight of God. That truth has always challenged me because it overturns so many assumptions. It reminds us that God does not evaluate people the same way human beings do. Finally, after several seconds, I answered. I said, I believe Jesus looks at the heart. There was another brief silence. Then Greg responded, exactly. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent years studying the words of Christ. Then he said something that has remained in my memory ever since. There are many leaders who succeed before the world and fail before God. I cannot explain why those words struck me so deeply. Perhaps because they are true. History is filled with examples. There have been leaders who built impressive careers yet left behind broken lives. Leaders who accumulated influence but lost their integrity. Leaders who gained power while slowly drifting away from humility. From a distance, they appeared successful. But success can sometimes hide deeper problems. The world often celebrates results. God examines motives. The world focuses on accomplishments. God looks at obedience. The world rewards visibility. God values faithfulness. As Greg spoke, I began reflecting on how easy it is for leaders to become distracted. At first, many people enter leadership with good intentions. They genuinely want to help others. They genuinely want to make a difference. But over time, something can change. Recognition arrives. Influence grows. Opportunities multiply. And if a person is not careful, the mission can slowly become centered on themselves. What began as service can become self-promotion. What began as responsibility can become entitlement. What began as humility can become pride. The danger often arrives gradually. Few people wake up one morning and decide to become arrogant. Instead, it happens little by little. A compliment here, an achievement there, a growing belief that one's importance is greater than it truly is. That is why Greg's question mattered so much. How does Jesus evaluate a leader? Not by the size of the audience, not by the number of followers, not by the amount of power accumulated, but by the condition of the heart, by character, by integrity, by faithfulness. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable the question became, because it did not merely apply to politicians. It applied to everyone. A father leading his family, a pastor leading a congregation, a business owner leading employees, a teacher leading students. Every person who influences others must eventually confront the same reality. God sees beyond what people see. He sees what no audience can see. He sees the motives that remain hidden. He sees the decisions made when nobody is watching. As our conversation continued, I sensed that Greg was leading me toward an even deeper question. We had spoken about leadership. We had spoken about accountability. We had spoken about the heart. But now we were approaching the issue that sits beneath all of them. The issue of who truly occupies first place in a person's life. Because leadership becomes dangerous when a leader begins to believe that he is the center of everything. And that realization led me to make a statement that surprised even Greg Laurie. It was not a statement about politics. It was not a statement about government. It was a statement about Jesus. And when I said it, the conversation suddenly became very quiet. As our conversation moved deeper, there was a noticeable change in tone. We were no longer discussing leadership in a general sense. We were no longer talking about principles that sounded good in a speech. We had reached a point where the discussion became personal, very personal. The question was no longer how a leader should behave. The question was what happens when leadership collides with faith? What happens when power and obedience stand on opposite sides of the road? What happens when a person must choose? Greg had spent much of the conversation encouraging me to think beyond public success, beyond influence, beyond reputation. Now the discussion centered on something even more important. Who truly occupies the highest place in a leader's life? For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I decided to say what had been forming in my mind throughout the call. I spoke slowly because I wanted my words to be clear. Greg, I said, in my opinion, the most dangerous leader is not a weak leader. He remained silent. Listening carefully, I continued. The most dangerous leader is the one who begins to believe that he is more important than God. The moment I said those words, the conversation stopped. There was no interruption from Greg, no immediate response. Only silence. Not the silence of disagreement, the silence of reflection. I think both of us understood the seriousness of that statement. Because throughout history, countless leaders have fallen into that trap. Some began with noble intentions. Some genuinely wanted to help their people. Some made sacrifices and worked hard. But somewhere along the journey, they stopped seeing themselves as servants. They began seeing themselves as indispensable. They began believing that everything depended on them, that their judgment could not be questioned, that their wisdom was sufficient, that their position made them untouchable. And once a leader begins to place himself above God, the decline has already started. Eventually, Greg spoke. His voice was calm. You've clearly thought about that. I answered honestly, yes, because I've spent enough years around politics and public life to understand how dangerous power can become. Most people think the greatest threat to a leader is opposition. Others think it is failure. Some believe it is criticism. But I have come to believe that the greatest threat often comes from within. It is pride, the quiet belief that success belongs entirely to us, the subtle temptation to trust ourselves more than God, the temptation to seek our own glory rather than His. Then I said something that surprised even me as it came out. It was not planned. It was simply the truth as I understood it. I told Greg, if a day ever comes when I must choose between power and Jesus Christ, I will choose Jesus. The line became completely silent. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I knew why. Because statements like that are easy to make when there is no cost attached. The real question is whether a person would still mean it when the cost becomes real. Then Greg asked exactly what I expected him to ask. Do you understand what that choice could cost you? His question was direct. There was no need for explanation. I understood immediately. Choosing Christ above everything else is not always popular. It can cost opportunities. It can cost influence. It can cost relationships. Sometimes it can cost reputation. For many believers throughout history, it has cost far more than that. I thought about Christians who had suffered because of their faith. Men and women who chose obedience, even when obedience was difficult. People who remained faithful when compromise would have been easier. Then I answered, yes. One word, simple, honest. Then I added something that had been weighing heavily on my heart. I cannot call him Lord if I only obey him when it benefits me. Those words seem to settle over the conversation because they expose the reality many Christians struggle with. It is easy to follow Jesus when everything is going well. It is easy to speak about faith when faith costs nothing. It is easy to declare loyalty when there is no sacrifice involved. But true faith is revealed when obedience becomes difficult. When doing the right thing requires courage. When following Christ means giving up something we desperately want to keep. Greg agreed immediately. He reminded me that Jesus never promised an easy road. He called people to take up their cross, to follow him faithfully, to place God above everything else, not just above some things, everything. As we continued talking, I found myself reflecting on how often society confuses power with greatness. Many people spend their entire lives chasing influence. They believe that if they can reach a certain position, they will finally have significance. But history tells a different story. Many powerful people are forgotten. Many famous people are forgotten. Many celebrated figures eventually disappear from public memory. Yet the influence of Jesus continues after more than 2,000 years. That fact alone should cause every leader to pause and think, because Jesus achieved something no earthly ruler ever could. He transformed lives without armies. He changed hearts without political office. He built a kingdom without worldly power. And his influence continues to reach people across nations, languages, and generations. As I thought about that truth, I realized something important. Leadership becomes dangerous when it points people toward ourselves. Leadership becomes meaningful when it points people toward something greater, toward truth, toward justice, toward God, toward Christ. The conversation had already challenged me deeply. But neither Greg nor I knew that the next part of our discussion would become even more profound. Because after talking about power and obedience, we began discussing the leadership model that Jesus himself demonstrated, a model the modern world often overlooks, a model that turns nearly every worldly definition of greatness upside down. After our discussion about power, obedience, and the place of Christ in a leader's life, Greg guided the conversation toward Jesus himself. Not merely his teachings, not merely his miracles, but the way he led people. I remember Greg saying something that immediately captured my attention. Julius, when you look at Jesus, you are looking at the greatest leader who ever lived. At first, some people might consider that a religious statement. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was also a historical observation. Because when we examine the life of Jesus, we discover something extraordinary. He possessed none of the things that the world normally associates with power. He did not rule a nation. He did not command an army. He did not occupy a political office. He did not own a palace. He did not control vast wealth. By worldly standards, he seemed to possess very little. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, billions of people continue to speak his name. That reality alone demands attention. History has produced emperors, kings, presidents, generals, and rulers of every kind. Many commanded enormous power during their lifetimes. Many controlled vast territories. Many seemed unstoppable. Yet countless names have faded into the pages of history. Their influence ended when their authority ended. Their power disappeared when their positions disappeared. But Jesus remains different. His influence did not end with his earthly life. In many ways, it expanded. That was one of the things Greg and I discussed at length. Why does the influence of Jesus endure while so much human power eventually fades? The answer seemed surprisingly simple. Jesus built his leadership on truth rather than control, on service rather than domination, on sacrifice rather than self-promotion. The world often teaches people to rise above others. Jesus chose to lift others up. The world encourages people to accumulate recognition. Jesus repeatedly directed attention toward his Father. The world rewards those who demand importance. Jesus demonstrated humility. As Greg spoke, I found myself thinking about how unusual that model remains even today. Modern society still celebrates visibility, followers, influence, personal branding, recognition. Many people spend years trying to build a name for themselves. But Jesus spent much of his ministry teaching people to deny themselves. That message remains difficult, perhaps because it challenges human nature. We naturally want to be noticed. We naturally want appreciation. We naturally want affirmation. Yet Jesus continually pointed his followers towards something greater than themselves. Greg then said something I wrote down shortly after the conversation ended because I did not want to forget it. God never called us to become famous. He called us to become faithful. When I heard those words, they stayed with me because faithfulness rarely attracts headlines. Faithfulness often happens quietly. A parent caring for a family, a pastor serving a congregation, a worker performing duties with integrity, a believer remaining committed to God when nobody is watching. The world may overlook those things. God does not. As our conversation continued, we reflected on how temporary human achievements can be. A leader may spend decades building influence. A business owner may spend years building a company. A public figure may spend a lifetime building a reputation. Yet all of those things can disappear remarkably quickly. One crisis, one mistake, one unexpected event, and suddenly everything changes. That does not mean achievements are meaningless. Far from it. But it does mean they are not ultimate. They are not eternal. The problem arises when people place their identity in things that cannot last. Titles, position, status, popularity. Those things are fragile foundations. Jesus offered something stronger. A foundation rooted in truth. A foundation rooted in obedience to God. A foundation that remains standing even when circumstances change. I told Greg that one of the greatest challenges for any leader is remembering that influence is temporary stewardship. It is not ownership. The people we lead do not belong to us. The opportunities we receive do not belong to us. Even our abilities are gifts. Everything entrusted to us carries responsibility. Greg agreed. Then he reminded me of something Jesus demonstrated repeatedly. The greatest leaders are often the greatest servants. That idea sounds simple, yet it stands in direct opposition to much of the world's thinking, because many people associate leadership with being served. Jesus associated leadership with serving others. The contrast could not be clearer, and perhaps that is why his example continues to challenge people centuries later. As we reflected on this, I began asking myself a difficult question. If Jesus were physically present in today's world, would many leaders even recognize his model of leadership? Or would they dismiss it as weakness? The truth is that humility is often misunderstood. Service is often underestimated. Faithfulness is often overlooked. Yet those very qualities transformed the world through Christ. The longer we spoke, the more convinced I became that modern society has not forgotten leadership techniques. It has forgotten the heart behind leadership. It has forgotten that influence exists to serve people rather than elevate ourselves. It has forgotten that true greatness often looks very different from public success. Eventually, Greg shifted the conversation once again. This time he asked a question that forced us to examine why so many leaders begin well but end poorly. Why people with talent, opportunity, and good intentions sometimes lose their way. And as we explored that question, both of us arrived at the same answer. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of skill, not lack of opportunity, but something far more dangerous, something that has destroyed leaders throughout history and continues to threaten leaders today. Pride. After speaking about the leadership model of Jesus, Greg asked me another question. By that point, nearly an hour had passed. Yet neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation. The topics we were discussing touched something deeper than politics, careers, or public life. They touched the human heart. Greg paused for a moment and then asked, "In your opinion, what destroys a leader?" The question came quickly. My answer came just as quickly, because I had spent enough years observing leadership to know what I believed. It is not a lack of talent, I said. It is not a lack of education. It is not a lack of opportunity. Then I added the word that immediately came to mind: pride. Greg responded almost instantly. I agree. There was no hesitation in his voice. No debate. No need for persuasion. We both understood how dangerous pride can be. What makes pride especially dangerous is that it rarely announces its arrival. It does not appear suddenly. It grows quietly, almost invisibly. Many leaders begin their journey with humility. They remember their struggles. They remember the people who helped them. They remember why they started. They remain grateful. They remain teachable. They remain grounded. But success changes the environment around them. People begin praising them. Supporters begin celebrating them. Achievements begin accumulating. Doors begin opening. And if they are not careful, they slowly start believing everything people say about them. Instead of remaining servants, they begin seeing themselves as the center of the story. That is where the danger begins. I told Greg that I had seen this pattern repeatedly throughout public life, not only in politics, everywhere. Business, religion, entertainment, community leadership. The specific circumstances change, but the pattern remains remarkably similar. A person gain influence. Influence produces recognition. Recognition feeds ego. Ego produces pride. And pride eventually clouds judgment. When that happens, leaders often stop listening. They stop learning. They stop accepting correction. The very qualities that help them succeed begin disappearing. Greg then brought the conversation back to Scripture. He mentioned King Saul, the first king of Israel. Saul began with humility. At the beginning of his story, he did not appear arrogant. He seemed aware of his limitations. But as time passed, something changed. Power altered his perspective. Instead of remaining obedient to God, he increasingly trusted his own judgment. Eventually, his pride led him away from the very source of wisdom he needed most. Then Greg mentioned King David. David's story was different. David also made serious mistakes. Mistakes that carried painful consequences. Yet one quality distinguished him. When confronted with his failures, he repented. He humbled himself before God. He recognized his need for mercy. As we discussed those two biblical figures, I noticed a powerful contrast. The issue was not perfection. Neither leader was perfect. The issue was humility. One resisted correction. The other accepted it. One defended himself. The other humbled himself. One allowed pride to take control. The other returned to God. That distinction remains relevant for leaders today because leadership does not require perfection. No human being is perfect. Every leader will make mistakes. Every leader will face moments of weakness. The critical question is how they respond when those moments come. Do they humble themselves, or do they allow pride to convince them they are beyond correction? Greg then shared an observation that I found particularly insightful. He said that many leaders spend years developing skills while spending very little time developing character. The world rewards competence, but competence alone is not enough. A person can possess remarkable talent and still cause tremendous damage if character is missing. A leader can be intelligent and still become destructive. A leader can be persuasive and still lead people in the wrong direction. Character is what determines how influence will be used. And character is often tested most severely after success arrives. That idea stayed with me because many people prepare for failure. Few prepare for success. Failure often drives people to prayer. Success sometimes convinces people they no longer need it. Failure reminds people of their dependence on God. Success can tempt people to forget it. As our conversation continued, I began reflecting on my own life. I thought about moments when criticism had been difficult to hear. Moments when it would have been easier to defend myself than to listen. Moments when pride could easily have gained a foothold. The truth is that none of us are immune. Not politicians, not pastors, not business leaders, not ordinary believers. Pride does not discriminate. It seeks entry wherever influence exists. That is why humility must be cultivated intentionally, not once, not occasionally, continually. Greg and I agreed that one of the healthiest questions a leader can ask is, who still has permission to tell me the truth? Because pride often isolates people. It surrounds them with agreement. It filters out correction. It creates an environment where honest feedback becomes rare. That environment is dangerous. Every leader needs people who care enough to speak honestly. People who are more interested in truth than approval. People who are willing to challenge when necessary. As we explored these ideas, the conversation began moving toward an even more sobering subject. Until that point, we had spoken about leadership in this life, influence in this life, success and failure in this life. But Greg was about to ask a question that shifted our attention beyond earthly leadership entirely. A question about eternity. A question about accountability before God. A question that every leader, every Christian, and every human being must eventually confront. When he asked it, I felt the weight of it immediately. Because it was not a question about what people think of us. It was a question about what God sees. And my answer surprised even me. By this point, the conversation had become deeply personal. We had talked about leadership. We had talked about service. We had talked about humility and the danger of pride. But now Greg shifted the discussion towards something even more serious. Something that every believer knows is real, yet many people rarely think about in their daily lives. Accountability before God. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Greg asked a question that immediately captured my full attention. Julius, he said, what is the thing you fear most as a leader? The question was direct. There was nowhere to hide behind prepared answers. No political language. No public relation response. Just a simple and honest question. What do I fear most? I thought about it carefully. Many people would assume the answer is losing an election. Others might assume it is losing influence. Some would say criticism. Others would say failure. Those are certainly things leaders think about. But as I sat there listening to Greg, I realized none of those answers reached the deepest level. Because all of those fears belong to this world. Elections come and go. Influence rises and falls. Public opinion changes. Positions are temporary. Eventually I answered. Honestly, Greg, what I fear most is standing before God one day and realizing that I used my influence the wrong way. After I said those words, there was silence again. A thoughtful silence. Because both of us understood what that statement meant. Every leader influences people. Some influence hundreds. Some influence thousands. Some influence millions. But influence itself is neither good nor bad. What matters is how it is used. A leader can use influence to encourage hope or to spread division, to help people or to exploit them, to serve truth or to manipulate it. One day, every leader must answer for those choices. That reality has become more significant to me as I have grown older. When we are young, we often focus on what we can achieve. As time passes, we begin thinking more about what we will leave behind, not merely accomplishments, legacy, not merely success, impact, not merely reputation, character. Greg responded thoughtfully. Then he said something that I believe every Christian leader should hear. This is a question we should ask ourselves every day. not once a year, not only during church services, every day, because leadership creates opportunities to influence people constantly. The decisions we make affect lives. The words we speak affect lives. The examples we set affect lives. And sometimes we do not fully realize how much influence we possess until years later. I reflected on that for a moment. Then I thought about something Jesus taught. He often spoke about stewardship, about being faithful with what had been entrusted to us. Whether that stewardship involves resources, responsibilities, relationships, or influence, the principle remains the same. Everything we have ultimately belongs to God. We are caretakers, not owners. That perspective changes everything. It changes how we view success. It changes how we view authority. It changes how we view leadership. Because if influence is a trust from God, then it must be handled with humility, not entitlement, with gratitude, not arrogance, with responsibility, not selfishness. As the conversation continued, I began reflecting on how easy it is for leaders to become preoccupied with earthly evaluations. People constantly evaluate leaders. Supporters evaluate them. Critics evaluate them. Media organizations evaluate them. History eventually evaluates them. Yet there is one evaluation that matters more than all the others: God's. That thought is both comforting and sobering. Comforting because God sees things that people often miss. Sobering because God sees things that people cannot see. He sees motives. He sees intentions. He sees hidden decisions. He sees the private moments that never become public. No title can impress him. No reputation can deceive him. No achievement can replace obedience. Greg reminded me that Scripture repeatedly points toward this reality. The day will come when every person stands before God. Not only leaders, everyone. And on that day, the question will not be how famous we became. It will not be how much power we accumulated. It will not be how many people applauded us. The deeper question will concern faithfulness. Did we use what God entrusted to us wisely? Did we serve others? Did we honor Him? Did we walk in truth? Those questions carry enormous weight. And perhaps that is why many people avoid thinking about them, because they force us to look beyond temporary concerns. They force us to think about eternity. As our conversation moved forward, I realized that Greg was not trying to make me fearful. He was trying to make me mindful. There is an important difference. Fear can paralyze people, but healthy accountability can guide them. It can keep leaders humble. It can keep priorities in the right order. It can remind us that influence is a gift, not an entitlement. Before long, Greg asked another question. This time, it was not about fear. It was about responsibility. Specifically, what message I would give to leaders around the world if I had the opportunity. At first glance, it seemed like a simple question. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it touched the very heart of everything we had discussed during that call. Service, humility, faithfulness, responsibility. The answer would become one of the most important parts of our entire conversation. Because leadership at its best is not about building ourselves. It is about serving the people God has placed in our care. After our discussion about accountability before God, Greg asked me a question that seemed simple on the surface. But the longer I thought about it, the more significant it became. Julius, he said, if you could say one thing to leaders around the world, what would it be? For a moment, I considered the question carefully. There are many things a leader could say. Advice about strategy, advice about communication, advice about management, advice about success. But none of those felt like the right answer. Not after the conversation we had just shared. Not after speaking about Jesus. Not after discussing humility, stewardship, and the reality of standing before God. Eventually I answered, do not spend your life building your own kingdom. I paused briefly. Then I continued, spend your life serving the people God has entrusted to you. The moment I said those words, I realized they applied far beyond politics. In fact, they may apply more strongly outside politics than within it. Because leadership exists in many forms. Some people lead nations. Others lead churches. Others lead businesses. Others lead communities. And many lead families. The truth is that leadership is not defined by a title. It is defined by responsibility. A father who guides his children is exercising leadership. A mother who sacrifices daily for her family is exercising leadership. A pastor caring for a congregation is exercising leadership. A business owner responsible for employees is exercising leadership. Wherever influence exists, leadership exists. Greg agreed immediately. Then he said something that expanded the discussion even further. He reminded me that every leader is shaping people, whether intentionally or unintentionally. People observe leaders closely. They notice actions, they notice attitudes, they notice priorities. Often they learn more from what leaders do than from what leaders say. That observation struck me because it reminded me that leadership is never purely personal. The choices we make affect others. Our integrity affects others. Our humility affects others. Our character affects others. That is why leadership carries such weight. I told Greg that one of the greatest mistakes leaders make is believing their influence belongs to them. It does not. Influence is a trust, a responsibility, a gift that should be handled carefully. And like every gift, it can be used wisely or foolishly. We talked about how many people spend years trying to become influential. Very few spend equal time preparing to use that influence well. Yet that preparation matters enormously because influence amplifies character. If character is strong, influence can accomplish tremendous good. If character is weak, influence can magnify damage. The conversation then moved toward a broader reflection on service. I told Greg that society often misunderstands service. Many people see service as weakness. They see it as something beneath them. Yet Jesus presented service as one of the highest expressions of leadership. That idea remains revolutionary. Even today, the world continues to celebrate those who dominate. Jesus celebrated those who serve. The world admires those who demand attention. Jesus honored those who humbly cared for others. The world often encourages self-promotion. Jesus taught self-sacrifice. That contrast remains as powerful now as it was centuries ago. Greg pointed out that Jesus never instructed his followers to build personal empires. He called them to build lives of faithfulness. That distinction is important because empires focus on self. Faithfulness focuses on God. Empires seek recognition. Faithfulness seeks obedience. Empires are temporary. Faithfulness has eternal value. As we continue talking, I found myself thinking about the many different people who might hear a message like this. Not only public leaders, ordinary men and women, people working quietly without public recognition, people caring for loved ones, people trying to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. Many of them may not see themselves as leaders, but influence is not measured only by numbers. Sometimes a person's greatest influence occurs within a single family. Sometimes it occurs through kindness, through integrity, through example, through faithfulness over many years. Those forms of leadership matter deeply. God sees them, and that thought encouraged me because it means that significance is not reserved for the powerful. Significance is available to anyone willing to serve faithfully. Before long, our conversation began approaching its conclusion. Nearly an hour had passed, yet it felt much shorter. We had discussed leadership, humility, service, pride, accountability, and faith. We had spoken about the example of Jesus and the responsibilities that come with influence. Then Greg asked one final question, a question unlike any he had asked before. It was personal, direct, and surprisingly difficult to answer. The moment I heard it, I knew I could not respond immediately because the answer required more than words. It required honest self-examination. And long after the phone call ended, that question continued echoing in my mind. As our conversation approached its end, there was a sense that we had covered a great deal of ground. We had spoken about leadership. We had spoken about humility. We had spoken about pride, service, accountability, and the example of Jesus. The call had lasted close to an hour, yet neither of us seemed eager to rush the final moments. Sometimes the most important part of a conversation comes at the very end. That proved true on this occasion. Before saying goodbye, Greg asked me one final question. It was not a complicated question. There were no theological terms, no political issues, no discussion of current events. Just a single question, but it carried enormous weight. Julius, he said, if Jesus appeared before you today, what part of your leadership would make you most proud to show him? The moment I heard those words, I stopped. I did not answer immediately. In fact, I could not, because my first instinct was to think about achievements. That is how many of us are conditioned to think. We naturally focus on accomplishments, victories, projects, successes, results. But the more I considered the question, the less confident I became in those answers. Would Jesus be most interested in achievements? Would he be most impressed by public recognition? Would he evaluate leadership the way the world often does? Deep down, I already knew the answer. No. That was why I remained silent. Greg did not pressure me to respond. He simply allowed the question to remain there. After a few moments, we exchanged our farewells. The conversation ended. The call disconnected, but the question remained. I sat quietly for a long time afterward. The room was silent. The city outside continued moving as it always does, yet my thoughts remained fixed on what Greg had asked. If Jesus stood before me today, what would truly matter? Would it be influence? Would it be reputation? Would it be accomplishments? Or would it be something deeper? The more I reflected, the more one realization became clear. Success is not measured by how many people follow you. Success is measured by how faithfully you follow God. That truth may sound simple, yet it changes everything. Because many people spend their lives trying to attract followers, trying to gain approval, trying to increase influence, trying to build a legacy. But faithfulness asks a different question. Not how many people followed you, but whether you followed Christ. Not how much power you accumulated, but how you used the power entrusted to you. Not how loudly people applauded, but whether God was honored. As I thought about those things, I remembered many of the themes Greg and I had discussed throughout the evening. The danger of pride, the temporary nature of power, the example of Jesus, the responsibility of leadership, the reality of accountability before God. All of them pointed toward the same conclusion. Leadership is not ultimately about ourselves. It is about stewardship. It is about service. It is about faithfulness. The world often rewards visibility. God rewards obedience. The world celebrates achievement. God values character. The world focuses on position. God looks at the heart. That realization did not arrive through a dramatic moment. There was no sudden revelation, no extraordinary experience, just a quiet recognition of a truth that had been present throughout our entire conversation. A truth that remains relevant for every believer, especially those entrusted with influence. Before going to bed that night, I found myself thinking about the countless people who carry leadership responsibilities every day. Parents, grandparents, pastors, teachers, business owners, community leaders, public servants. Some lead large groups, others lead only a few people, but all of them face the same essential challenge. Will they use their influence to serve or to elevate themselves? Will they pursue faithfulness or merely recognition? Will they remember that leadership is a responsibility entrusted by God? Or will they treat it as personal ownership? Those questions matter because every leader leaves an imprint on the lives of others. And every leader will one day answer for that influence. That is why Greg's final question continues to stay with me. Not because it was difficult, but because it was honest. And perhaps honesty is exactly what many of us need more of. Not only in leadership, but in our relationship with God. So before I leave you with this story, I want to leave you with the same question Greg Laurie left with me. If Jesus were evaluating your life today, what would he see? Would he see someone chasing power? Or someone learning to serve? Would he see someone building a personal kingdom? Or someone seeking to be faithful? Would he see a heart focused primarily on itself? Or a heart that is slowly becoming more like his? Those are not easy questions, but they are important ones. And they are the questions that remained in my heart long after that unexpected phone call from California had ended. After that conversation, I spent a great deal of time reflecting on what had been said and on the world we are living in today. I realize that although we come from different countries, different cultures, and sometimes even different beliefs, there are certain things that people everywhere continue to search for: dignity, justice, truth, hope. Over the years, I have watched powerful systems rise and fall. I have seen leaders come and go. I have heard promises that sounded impressive but failed to improve the lives of ordinary people. And through all of it, I have learned something important. No nation can truly be strong while its people continue to live in poverty, fear, or injustice. That is why I believe real change does not begin in halls of power. It does not begin with titles. It does not begin with speeches. Real change begins when ordinary people choose to live according to their conscience, when they choose truth instead of convenience, when they choose courage instead of silence, when they stand up for those who have no voice. I hope future generations will build a world that is more just than the one we inherited. A world where people are valued for their character rather than their status. A world where unity is stronger than division. A world where compassion is stronger than greed. A world where service is valued more highly than self-interest. The road ahead may not be easy. There will always be challenges. There will always be obstacles. But I still believe that people who remain united, protect their dignity, and stand firmly for what is right will always have the power to change their future. Because in the end, hope does not belong to those who simply wait for miracles. Hope belongs to those who continue working toward a better tomorrow. And before I leave you, I would like to ask you something. If this story encouraged you, take a moment to share your thoughts and encourage someone else who may need hope today. Let us continue reminding one another that faith, truth, and service still matter. And let us never forget the question Greg Laurie left in my heart that evening. If Jesus evaluated your life today, would he find someone seeking power or someone learning how to serve like him?